Technology and General Services Committee will now come to order. We'll take the items up in the order that they appear on the agenda. We'll begin with item number 1.
Item number 1, continued from July 29, 2008, GSD report, response to motion, Weisar Cardenas, relative to directing the GSD to report on what steps it is taking to deal with higher gasoline prices and the potential impacts to the city budget.
Good afternoon. I'm Angela Sherrick with the Department of General Services. On July 29, 2008, ITGS requested that GSD report back on steps GSD is taking to deal with higher gasoline prices, actions that we're taking to control fuel consumption, and the potential impacts on the city's budget. This report today will be specific to the steps that GSD is taking to both track fuel consumption and to control its usage. In 1999, GSD started the fuel automation program, which required us to upgrade all of our fuel sites. By 2004, GSD had completed the installation of the equipment on all 136 fuel sites and 6 communication towers. This allows us to monitor all the fuel deliveries and also to reconcile invoices. By 2006, GSD had hired one position to resolve communication issues that arose from the new system that we installed. And in April of 2008, we basically reorganized and used existing funding to put another staff member part-time on the project. That staff member was able to start reviewing individual transactions, and by reviewing those transactions, we found discrepancies. Based on those discrepancies, we instituted several fuel site security programs.
Give me an example of a discrepancy.
Some of the discrepancies that we have found are discrepancies on fuel usage at different sites. And we are basically working on an investigation right now on several sites that we found these discrepancies.
So you're talking about discrepancies. Potentially there could be a misuse of our fuel?
That's correct. And so as soon as we found those discrepancies, we immediately instituted several processes to stop those problems. And so the report that you have before you are talking about some of the things that we've instituted. The first one was the CAN card program. In July 2008, the city had about 500 CAN cards, and those cards are used to get fuel for small equipment. So basically the cans, you can get about 5 gallons of fuel. But we had 500 cards, and the departments were responsible for actually disseminating those cards. What we did was we canceled all of them. We reissued them with the general manager's approval for each individual department. So right now we have about 250 cards out there. We're going to be going back through that program once again, and we're going to institute even stricter usage of the CAN cards. So right now we have 250. We're going to go back, look at them again, and institute yet another program which will allow them only to use those cards twice in a 24-hour period. We've instituted the twice in a 24-hour period program already for vehicles. So currently every city vehicle, with the exception of police and fire, can only get fuel twice in a 24-hour period. And that, again, that's something that we instituted after finding some of the discrepancies in the programs. Another process that we're instituting is called the strict odometer program. And what that does is when a person uses a fuel card, it will require them to put specific information into the system. And you will only be able to be off by a certain mileage amount. If you're off by over that amount, you will not be allowed to get fuel. In conjunction with this program, we've started something called the passive system. In the passive system, on each individual vehicle, fleet has installed an antenna. And the antenna on the vehicle talks to the antenna on the fuel site. And so it takes the human error out of it completely. So the nozzle talks to the car, and the car gives the nozzle the information and puts it into the fueling system. And so we eliminate theft completely with that program, and that's what we're working towards. We anticipate that that will take about a year to complete.
Now that antenna system not only communicates, but it also checks whether or not that, for example, that vehicle has fueled X number of times in 24 hours, et cetera. So you put all the safeguards into that system.
That's correct. So again, we won't have any vehicles that are allowed to fuel more than twice in a 24-hour period. There will be some exceptions, but those exceptions will have to be approved by the general manager of that specific department.
And the odometer information will be part of that antenna system as well?
That's correct, and we've started implementation of the antenna system. We actually started that in September. So we are going to each individual fuel site, and we have staff that actually goes to sites and makes sure that the information on each individual vehicle is correct, and then that information is loaded into the system. And I don't think anybody from sanitation is here today, but I want to thank sanitation because they actually are assisting us in this by allowing us to use light-duty employees to go to each of the fuel sites and actually do the manual work of inputting the information. So it's really a big help. With 136 sites, we're anticipating, again, that it will take us about a year to complete this portion of the program. But we think that it is something that the city really needs, and we think that it will really enhance our security. In addition to these 4 programs, we have also started locking the fuel pumps after hours. We lock the fuel pumps at the end of the day and also on the weekends. Each individual site supervisor is given a key so that they can have access if they need to after hours and on the weekends. Otherwise, they won't have access to the sites. So in addition to the other 4 programs that I talked about, we're also locking the fuel sites. And finally, one of the things that we've done is we've started a fuel automation task force. And what this task force has done is it's taken all the departments and introduced them to the new reports that the system can generate. So at our first meeting, we had about 54 representatives from the mayor's office, council offices, and also all of the departments. And those departments gave us feedback on reports that they believe would be helpful to make operational decisions with respects to the purchase of vehicles and the usage of fuel. So those are some of the things that we've implemented to enhance fuel site security. And again, in addition to this, GSD is working with the mayor's office and the CAO on another working group that will come back before this committee and report on specific other projects that we're working on to look at controlling fuel cost and also working with other entities to cut down on fuel cost. But for this meeting, we wanted to come before you and tell you some of the things that are very far-reaching that GSD has implemented since July of 2008.
All right, I have some questions for you. The report talks about the fuel costs at $3.26 per gallon for diesel fuel and $3.05 per gallon for unleaded fuel. However, the current cost of diesel fuel is higher than that, and so is the cost of gasoline as well. How do you budget for the fuel and for that difference?
Ordinarily, what we do is when we generated the budget that you're looking at right now, it was generated in August of last year. And so unfortunately, the cost of fuel, as everyone knows, has been very volatile. So ordinarily, when we begin the new year, we start with at least as much as we spent the previous year. This year, that hasn't been the case. Last year, we were budgeted for about $39 million, and we spent about $49 million. So we already know that we're going to be coming in higher than what we were budgeted at. And so the only way that we can actually bring those costs in line is to keep track of the cost of fuel and then come back before this committee in Budget and Finance and request additional funding when we need it.
And don't we have opportunities to buy our fuel in bulk? I mean, don't we get price locks, things of that nature? How often do we do that?
We have annual contracts, and we already do buy our fuel in bulk. And in fact, with respects to fuel cost, the city is actually getting probably the best prices within the county right now. So we do take advantage of the bulk and discount pricing. However, with the market being as volatile as it is, there's almost no way to come in right on budget. It's very difficult right now.
The only way to make that improvement beyond things we can't control are what we can control, which is internal controls of making sure that people are being efficient, people are minding what trips are mandatory and which trips they can combine with others, et cetera. In other words, good practices.
And I think that's kind of what this report talks about. It talks about the things that we can do. We can control when people get fuel. We can control the odometer readings. We can give this information to the general managers to let them make good decisions in terms of the number of vehicles that they purchase and the trips that they're taking. So once we actually generate these reports, we'll put them on a website, and the departments will be able to access them themselves so that they can make the types of decisions that you're talking about, make good decisions.
Have we been able to save money by our bulk fuel contracts? And if we have, what are the round figures that the difference? What's the difference?
Well, as of today, fuel, if you go to commercial sites, the unleaded is about $3.59. The city right now is paying $3.31. You multiply that, we use about 7 million gallons of unleaded a year. So you multiply that $3.50, about 40 cent savings. It's about tremendous, about $500,000 savings right there, or more than that.
And when you look at the price at the pump when you're driving by a gas station, that includes all of the taxes and fees or what have you. Do we pay those in our bulk pricing?
We do pay. In fact, the price of $3.31 today that we're paying includes everything.
Okay, that includes everything. Are we exempt from any of those taxes on fuel?
Actually not. The only exemption we have is the federal excise tax, but other than that, we pay everything.
So if there's any state fees or local fees, we have to pay them?
Yes, that's correct.
Interesting. All right. The report talks about how the city's fleet was reduced by 900 vehicles. Can you give me an example of where the majority of that came from and how we went about reducing our fleet by 900?
That was actually part of the mayor's reduction plan, and each department actually had to come up with a list of vehicles that they were going to reduce by. So those numbers were actually submitted by each individual department to GSD, and GSD actually helped with collecting the vehicles from the departments.
What happened to those vehicles?
Those vehicles will be sold as part of salvage.
Okay. And how are we holding on that 900 reduction?
Some of the departments have come back in and had discussions about whether or not they would be able to adhere to the list that they originally submitted. And in those cases, the mayor's office and fleet will sit down and have a discussion with the departments to determine whether or not they can actually adhere to the list that they originally submitted.
Which departments seem to have the largest gross number of vehicles reduced?
You know, I'm sorry, I can't really respond to that. That's more of a fleet question, but we can come back to you with that.
Yeah, I'd like the answer to that question. You could report back to this committee. Also, how did the police department do when it came to their reduction? Or did they expand the number of vehicles?
Again, that's something I'll have to come back to you with.
Okay. I know we have more officers, so on the natural, if we have more officers on an average day, on an average month, on an average year, because we are hiring more officers, I can understand having more vehicles, but at the same time, even with that, I would hope and expect that we have some kind of offset on some efficiencies and best practices. Maybe we can, when you get back to me, hopefully we'll see something where they have a stagnant number, even though they categorically, they may have more vehicles, for example, police cars, black and whites. Maybe they have more black and whites, but they were able to find some efficiencies in other areas. So I'd like to know, but the police department was part of the report?
The police department was part of the report.
Sometimes the police department is not part of reports.
We've found all the departments to really work well with us on this report, and they have been part of the fuel automation task force as well, and they have given us feedback on reports that they'd like to see.
Mm-hmm. And when vehicles are sold, like you just described, that these vehicles will be sold, where do the proceeds go from those sales? To go back to fleet services, or does it?
I believe that the proceeds from these
I
sales
think
will go to
somebody might be able to shed some light on that question.
Ken Desowitz, Director of Supply Services for General Services. The salvage revenue goes back to each individual department that owned that vehicle. So if it was a police vehicle, it would go into the police general fund. If it was a fire vehicle, fire general fund.
I guess that makes sense if we're going to motivate them to be aggressive about. So if they see the vehicles disappear and then they don't see anything come back, I mean, what's the incentive?
And then they use that money to purchase the replacement vehicles.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for answering that. Anything else? Okay. Is anybody here to make public comment on item number 1? We're on item number 1 in this committee. Seeing and hearing no one come forth on public comment. Public comment is now closed. With that, we'll note and file this report. The next item on the agenda, item number 2.
Item number 2, CAO report relative to a proposed Fourth Amendment to contract number C-108757 with the Los Angeles Cable Television Access Corporation to continue providing citywide public access and educational programming on Channel 36.
Good afternoon, Delilah Pucha, CAO. The proposed agreement is between ITA and the Los Angeles Cable Television Access Corporation to provide citywide public access and educational programming on Channel 36. The proposed amendment will extend the term by 1 year from 3 years to 4 years through June 30th, 2009, and increase the maximum allowable compensation by $605,000 up to $2,345,000. The proposed funding of $605,000 was approved in the 2008-09 budget. This office recommends that council approve and authorize the general manager of the Information Technology Agency to execute the Fourth Amendment to contract number 108757 with Los Angeles Cable Television Access Corporation and instruct the Information Technology Agency to explore the possibility of pursuing a competitive bidding process in accordance with the city's contracting policies prior to the expiration of the proposed agreement. Funding for this agreement is included in the Telecommunications Liquidated Damages and Lost Franchise Fee Fund. There is no additional impact on the general fund. Department representatives are here to answer any questions you may have.
Now, basically, we're in a new world now. Before, when it came to public access, by and large, the vast majority of that was being provided by cable companies, correct? Can you describe for us what that world order was back then?
Well, if I may,
Your name again?
prior franchise agreements that were in
Say your
effect.
name.
I'm
They're gonna
sorry,
think-
William Imperial from ITA.
William, they're going to think that she changed her voice.
Right, right. And I did this once before, and I apologize to you. It's better to say my name at the beginning rather than at the end.
We can't even think straight around here. That's crazy.
Very good. If I may, the prior franchise agreements that were preempted by the state 2 years ago and now affect the city as of 2008.
But hold on a second. I want you to go back at least a step further back. What franchise agreements are you talking about? Who were the franchise agreements with?
The city of Los Angeles, under federal law, had the right to franchise the cable incumbent operators. In 1987, the most recent city and cable company franchise agreements were put into effect. Under those franchise agreements, public educational and governmental access was actually put into place, with the city holding the operations and continuing to fund the operations of the governmental access channel. The educational access channel was funded in part with some monies from the cable operators. It was provided through the cable franchises. And the public access system was operated and continues to be operated until January 1st, 2009 by the incumbent cable operators. In that regard, it would be Time Warner and Cox.
So how was the government access funded, basically?
It was initially funded through franchise fees that were specially earmarked under our franchise agreements outside of the franchise fees that we normally get. Those payments ended in 2001 and that had commenced in 1987 to the city. So essentially from 2002 to the present, the city has been funding governmental access and educational access.
And the public access part?
Again, it is run by Time Warner and Cox, is fully operated and funded by them. And that will expire, the obligation to do that will expire on January 1st.
And why is that going to expire?
Because of the new state law that preempts the city's franchising rights to the Public Utilities Commission.
Okay, so the franchising used to be done by local governments, like, for example, the city of Los Angeles.
That's correct.
And now it's the Public Utilities Commission that are granting those franchise agreements?
Yes.
So the state is going to be sending money down to the cities so that there can continue to be government access and public access?
Well, under the new law, the city is entitled to receive a 1% gross revenue franchise fee from the cable operators and the video TV service operators. Those would be the telephone companies. That 1% we estimate to be about $5 million, and we expect to receive it in the coming year, if not sooner.
It's about $5 million, but don't we have estimates as to, in yesterday's world order on government access and public access, about how much was being invested in that on an annual basis, the way it used to be handled?
The city is spending $3.1 million for the funding of government access, and $655,000 is what we're proposing for LACTAC, for educational access. Whether the city wants to go forward and fund public access in place of what Time Warner is doing is an issue that we expect to take up with the city council and mayor
But
soon.
conceivably, if we did that, we'd probably end up confining ourselves to the $5 million in revenue.
Well, the problem with the $5 million is that we expect to receive in new monies is that under federal law, it's restricted to capital use only, meaning for brick and mortar and equipment. It doesn't, what cannot be used for operational expenses. And if it is used for operational expenses, the cable operators could tell the city that they were going to withhold their fees because we've misused those funds.
So they could actually think that the remedy is to withhold their fees rather than just take us to court?
Yeah. They could, more likely than not, they'll have to take us to court. Those self-help provisions aren't in the state law.
Now, before the new state law, about how much what was our understanding of how much was going into public access?
We had an estimate that the city obtained on its own that has never been fully vetted with the cable operators of somewhere between $5 to $8 million to run the public access studios.
So $5 million is on the low end.
Yes.
Now you're talking about public access studios, $5 to $8 million.
Only public
Plus,
access.
in yesterday's terms, we were still spending just about $3 million or so on the government access.
Correct.
And now it seems like we have a pot of money that is a total sum of approximately $5 million for both, if we want to continue both?
For capital costs only, not operational expenses.
What was the argument at the federal level to restrict it to capital improvements?
Well, this goes back to the initial telecommunications acts that have been in place for a number of years, going back to 1934, actually, but with regard to cable services to 1974. And so as the laws have been changed at the federal level, the cable operators made the argument that we will not operate or fund your operations of your studios as part of those costs, but we will provide buildings and structures and equipment for you.
Councilman Mark Wolf with ITA. As you can imagine, this greatly hampers the city's ability to support an ongoing operation of a public access channel because of the fact of being restricted in use of this 1% funding to capital only. So it really it presents us with a great challenge, and it's going to make it very difficult for us to be able to have ongoing operations of a facility for public access. So it's going to really require, we're in the process of having dialogue with the incumbents to talk about alternative ways that we could preserve some of the public access facilities. Today there's 14 of them. The reality is it's going to be very difficult for the city to be able to sustain that number of sites, and will be a real question of what we'll be able to sustain with the city's funding.
So is there any legislation or is there any congressperson who understands this well enough to at least change the regs on what the money can be used for, as long as it's used for public access, be it ongoing non-bricks and mortar versus only bricks and mortar?
There is proposed legislation that was put forth on September 17th of this year before one of the committees of the House, the Congressional House, And when I say they, the proponents would be NATOA, the National Association for Telecommunications Officers and Advisors, the League of Cities and others have proposed and are seeking a sponsor for that particular amendment, very simple amendment to the federal code that would unrestrict the use of that 1% PEG capital fee for the city of Los Angeles. When I say for the city, I mean in terms of federal law, it would unrestrict the use of PEG monies that are earmarked as PEG monies for unlimited use for PEG-related purposes.
Mm-hmm. But for PEG purposes.
PEG-related purposes.
So I guess congressional members missed the boat. This is something, nice little amendment they could have put on that $800+ billion Christmas tree that they just passed.
Well, if you
because there's no law against that, right? I mean, the germaneness is really out the window on those kinds of matters, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So this is something that some congressional member could have leveraged if they were paying attention. They could have said, no. We have a little problem that on January 1st is going to cause a problem throughout the country for the new order of things, and how are we going to, if we're committed to PEG, how, we're limiting the local governments, local entities from utilizing the money and sustaining those facilities. All we're telling them, go ahead and use the money, go build a structure and put the infrastructure there, but don't use the money. You can't use the money to make sure that you can continue to run it.
Yes,
correct?
It's a national issue right now. It really is.
Yeah. And it doesn't seem like any of the communications companies are spending much time lobbying to try to correct that?
Not at all.
Or they're pretty much done now that they got what they wanted on the state level and the federal regs?
Well, I think they're waiting to see what happens, see who can recover and who can't.
I'm sorry, what?
I would think that they're sitting back waiting to see what cities can recover and continue with their PEG operations and which ones cannot, because then the channel would be lost to the cable operator.
Oh, so they're not waiting so much because they want to see us be successful. They're just waiting because the fallout of that is if we don't utilize those channels, then they will go back to them.
That's correct.
Which means that increases their capacity.
That's correct.
And they will not be required to use it for PEG purposes.
That's right.
Do you think they'd be looking forward to getting those channels if the default was you get it back, but now you have to make that a PEG channel?
Well, yeah, I agree. I think you're correct. In fact, that's a rhetorical statement. I'll accept it as such. But these channels are worth millions of dollars, especially because they're on the lowest tier, the lower tier, and you can put infomercials on there all day and night rather than run a PEG channel. Mm-hmm. So, given that over a 10-year period of the franchise that's allowed under DIVCA, under the new state law, if you multiply that by 10 years, you're talking about
Can this be
millions
remedied
of
at the state level, or it has to be remedied at the federal level when it comes to the utilization of this 1%?
Has to be done at this federal level.
I've seen some debates. I don't think any presidential or vice presidential candidates are saying this is a big issue for them.
It could have been done at the state level, had the state chosen to do so, but they did not.
Well, who wrote the bill? Was it the legislators?
Yes. They were the franchisor, if you think. They became the franchisor when they enacted the new law and set the terms franchise. They could have cut out.
Yeah, but the bill seems to be written addressing certain issues that the industry wanted to have addressed, but not necessarily issues that were outside of their concern.
Councilman, the draft bill was definitely written by the telecommunications industry.
And who's the biggest one?
AT&T, Verizon.
Well, today AT&T is much bigger than Verizon, I think.
Much bigger. It's AT&T.
Yeah.
AT&T did this in 2005 and changed the law in 2005 in Texas, where they're based. Came to California in 2006 and changed the law here, and have done so in about 20 states, if not just a little bit more.
Since then?
Since then.
Wow. So Texas was the first big state?
Yes, they're based in San Antonio. AT&T is.
Interesting. All right, well, now we have a dilemma. We have to figure out how committed we are to PEG. We certainly seem committed when we were forcing the people coming to us for franchise agreements to make sure that they continued it. So much, was it 14 or 16 facilities?
14.
14 facilities. I thought it was 16.
You might have thought it was 16 because there were 14, but 2 are interconnected. So that's probably where you got the 16 from.
And what are the individual recommendations on this report?
The CAO recommends that council approve and authorize the general manager to execute the agreement with the Los Angeles Cable Television Access Corporation and to instruct the Information Technology Agency to explore the possibility of pursuing a competitive bidding process in accordance with city policies prior to the expiration of the proposed agreement.
And Councilman, if I could add, the Board of Information Technology Commission and Municipal Access Policy Board filed a report to council and to the mayor for recommendations on how to move forward with PEG in the future. So that's an item that's still pending to go before this committee, and where we can get into a deeper discussion of really different alternatives and recommendations for the council and for the mayor for public education and government access. As CAO has indicated, this contract that's before you, the amendment, is for, again, putting in place the contract for this current fiscal year, which was adopted by council for continued operation of Channel 36. And with the change that it did provide some additional funding for Channel 36 to take on some public access type of role. And the deeper discussion of that we can have with you when we come back before you to discuss the public education government access report.
We definitely will. But Delilah, when it comes to the second recommendation, where it says instruct the Information Technology Agency to explore the possibility of pursuing a competitive process to select a provider to manage Channel 36, and if deemed to be feasible, complete the competitive process to select a contractor prior to this agreement's expiration.
Yep.
What kind of who is likely to bid on that?
Councilmember, in accordance with our city policies, we have to attempt to do a competitive bidding process for large amounts and for several years. In the 1022 determination, the personnel department has indicated that there are city employees to do the work. If we go out for competitive bidding in RFP or RFQ, if we get responses, and the department has a jurisdiction to select who is the more appropriate, but at least before we continue a contract that we had for over 10 or 15 years, we've made the attempt to do an RFP or RFQ, which is our current policies. If no one responds, if there's no outside agencies, at least we did its due diligence and did an RFP.
So conceivably, in that process, the current operators of Channel 36 would bid it as well?
Yes. The department would prepare the request for proposal and lay out its qualifications, and they would also select a party to score each RFP or RFQ, whoever puts in a bid and meets the guidelines. Whoever meets the qualifications in accordance with the department can then select them for future agreements. But this is the Fourth Amendment, which has been going on for several years. So we want to make every attempt to abide by the city policies that exist instead of selecting the same contractor for several years.
Anything, William?
Yes, thank you. May I suggest something on this report? ITA doesn't have any objection to being instructed by a council, of course, at any time on this issue. But this issue should be wrapped into our presentation of the Bitsy-Matby report at a later date so we can vet this particular issue, because there's a history of a partnership that we've had with Channel 36 out of the creation of, that comes from the creation of Channel 36 as part of inner working group that the city created under the franchise agreements. And so we've treated this as a sole source contract, and rather than get into what the city's policies and the obligations of ITA is at this particular juncture, that you defer consideration of number 2, hold it in this committee until we come back on the Bitsy-Matby report obligations, because it would be tied into how the city's policies would be affected.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm one of the few people elected in this city that does not agree with the interpretation of the charter when it comes to sometimes how different individuals or departments interpret our requirements when it comes to what we can or can't contract out, under what circumstances we have to actually go out to bid, et cetera. And you're absolutely right, William. I think that in the context of other matters that we should be discussing surrounding this issue, I think that that's the perfect time for us to take this matter up as well on the second recommendation from the CAO report. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Is anybody here to speak to item number 2 on public comment? We're on item number 2, and public comment is now open. Seeing and hearing no one come forward on item 2 for public comment. Public comment on item 2 is now closed. With that, it'll be the recommendation of this committee, of the chair of this committee, to approve the first recommendation in the CAO report and to hold the second recommendation and combine that discussion with the future matters discussed in this committee. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is anybody here to make public comment to this committee on general public comment, as we had just finished both of the 2 items agendized for this committee? We are now open for general public comment. Is anybody here for general public comment to this committee? Seeing and hearing none, general public comment to this committee is now closed. This committee is now adjourned.